The rain hammered down on the cracked pavement of Maple Street, turning the sidewalk into a river of grime and forgotten dreams. It was nearly midnight when Margaret finally locked the front door of her small bakery, her fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from exhaustion that had seeped into her bones. She'd been on her feet for 16 hours straight, and all she wanted was to collapse into her threadbare couch and forget about the unpaid bills stacked on her kitchen counter. But as she turned toward the dimly lit alley where she'd parked her decade-old sedan, 3 sleek black cars emerged from the darkness, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. Her breath caught in her throat. The vehicles moved in perfect formation, stopping just feet away from where she stood frozen. The driver's door of the lead car opened slowly, and a figure stepped out, tall and confident, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Margaret's hand instinctively went to her chest as recognition flickered across her weathered face, her eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and something she couldn't quite name. For years, she thought her small acts of kindness had disappeared into the void, unnoticed and unrewarded. She never expected anything in return. She certainly never expected this. But standing there in the pouring rain, watching these strangers approach her with purpose and emotion etched into their faces, Margaret realized that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples. Sometimes what we think is forgotten is actually being remembered in ways we could never imagine. And sometimes, just sometimes, kindness finds its way back home. T's key questions. Who were these people in cars that cost more than most houses on her street? Why had they tracked her down after all these years? What could possibly connect this exhausted bakery owner to such wealth and obvious success? The answers to these questions would reveal a story so unexpected, so deeply moving, that it would challenge everything you think you know about human connection and the power of compassion. This wasn't a chance encounter. It wasn't coincidence. It was the culmination of a journey that began 15 years earlier, when 3 desperate children with hollow eyes and empty stomachs stumbled into Margaret's life and changed it forever. Those children were triplets, abandoned by a system that had failed them, surviving on scraps and the occasional mercy of strangers who looked past them more often than at them. Margaret saw them. More than that, she fed them. Every single day, without fail, for years. She never asked for recognition. She never posted about it on social media or told her friends what she was doing. It was just something she felt compelled to do, a quiet rebellion against a world that had grown too comfortable ignoring suffering. But here's what Margaret didn't know during all those years of slipping warm bread and soup to 3 hungry kids: they were watching her just as closely as she was feeding them. They were learning. They were remembering. They were making promises to themselves about what they would do if they ever got the chance to escape poverty's grip. And now, standing in front of her bakery in the rain, those promises were about to be kept in ways that would leave her absolutely speechless. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Backstory. 15 years earlier, Margaret Sullivan was a different woman living a different life. She'd just turned 42, recently divorced, and was trying to rebuild from the ruins of a 20-year marriage that had crumbled under the weight of her ex-husband's gambling addiction. The bakery on Maple Street wasn't her dream, it was her lifeline, the only thing standing between her and complete financial collapse. She'd bought it with the last of her savings and a loan from her elderly father, who'd looked at her with concern but supported her anyway because that's what family did. The shop itself was nothing special, just 800 square feet of worn linoleum floors, outdated equipment, and a fading sign that read, "Sullivan's Bread and Pastries." But Margaret poured everything she had into making it work. She arrived at 4 every morning to start the ovens, kneaded dough until her shoulders ached, and stayed late into the evening cleaning and prepping for the next day. The neighborhood wasn't gentrified or trendy. It was working class, the kind of place where people counted pennies and stretched paychecks, where children played in streets that needed repaving and elderly folk sat on porches watching the world slowly change around them. Margaret's customers were loyal but budget-conscious, buying day-old bread at discount prices and occasionally splurging on a birthday cake. She made enough to keep the lights on and pay her modest rent for the studio apartment above a laundromat 3 blocks away. There was nothing glamorous about her existence, but there was dignity in it, purpose in the simple act of providing something fundamental, something that brought small moments of joy to people who didn't have many. She knew most of her customers by name, remembered their preferences, asked about their families. The bakery became more than a business. It became a gathering place, a warm refuge from harsh realities, a reminder that simple pleasures still existed even when life felt overwhelming. It was on a particularly cold morning in November when Margaret first saw them. 3 children, no older than 8 or 9, huddled together outside her shop window, their noses pressed against the glass, staring at the fresh cinnamon rolls she'd just pulled from the oven. They wore mismatched clothes that were too thin for the weather, and their faces had that gaunt, hollow look that comes from chronic hunger. Margaret's heart cracked open right there. She'd seen homeless people in the neighborhood before, but there was something about these 3 identical faces, these triplets who should have been in school with full bellies and warm coats, that she simply couldn't ignore. Without thinking, she opened the door and called out to them. They scattered like frightened birds, running halfway down the block before stopping to look back with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Margaret held up a paper bag and set it down on the sidewalk in front of her shop, then stepped back inside, watching through the window as they cautiously approached. The oldest, she would later learn his name was Daniel, grabbed the bag and they disappeared around the corner. Inside were 3 cinnamon rolls, still warm, and 3 small cartons of milk. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, they were back, same spot, same hungry eyes. This time Margaret didn't wait. She prepared 3 bags before opening and handed them directly to the children, who mumbled barely audible thank yous before running off again. This pattern continued for weeks. Margaret would prepare breakfast for the triplets, Daniel and his siblings Emma and Lucas, and they would appear like clockwork just after sunrise to collect it. Slowly, tentatively, they began to stay longer, to exchange a few words, to reveal fragments of their story. Their mother had died when they were 6. Their father couldn't cope and surrendered them to the foster system. They'd been bounced between 3 different homes in 2 years, each placement worse than the last, until they ran away together 6 months ago, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the certainty of separation and abuse. Margaret's routine expanded. Breakfast became breakfast and dinner. She started keeping extra clothes in the back room, things she picked up at thrift stores or received as donations when she quietly mentioned to trusted customers that she knew some children in need. The triplets never stayed long, never revealed where they slept, but they came every day without fail, and Margaret made sure they never left hungry. Her profit margins, already thin, became almost non-existent. There were weeks when she had to choose between buying ingredients and paying her electric bill. She chose the ingredients. Always the ingredients. Her father noticed the strain during his weekly visits and offered to help, but Margaret refused, insisting she was managing just fine even as the circles under her eyes grew darker and her clothes hung looser on her thinning frame. Some of her regular customers noticed too. Mrs. Chen, who bought bread every Tuesday, started leaving extra money on the counter with a knowing nod. Mr. Rodriguez began ordering twice as many pastries as he needed and telling Margaret to give the extras to whoever might need them. The community, in its quiet way, was supporting her mission even if she'd never asked them to. But there were critics too. Some neighbors complained about the triplets hanging around, worried they'd attract more homeless people to the area or scare away business. One particularly vocal customer, a middle-aged woman named Patricia who always had an opinion about everything, confronted Margaret one afternoon, asking why she was enabling street children instead of calling social services like a responsible citizen should. Margaret looked her straight in the eye and said something she'd never forget, "These aren't street children, Patricia. They're children on the street. There's a difference. And I'd rather enable their survival than enable a system that's already failed them once." Patricia never came back to the bakery after that, but Margaret didn't care. She'd made her choice, and she'd live with the consequences. What she couldn't have known, what she couldn't possibly have imagined as she handed warm food to 3 frightened children day after day, was that she was planting seeds that would grow into something extraordinary. One particular evening stood out in Margaret's memory, even years later. It was December, and an early snowstorm had blanketed the city in white. The triplets showed up later than usual, their thin jackets dusted with snow, shivering so violently their teeth chattered. Margaret took one look at them and made a decision. She locked the front door of the bakery, flipped the sign to closed even though she had 2 hours of business left, and brought the children inside to the back room where she kept a small space heater. She made them hot chocolate and gave them blankets to wrap around their shoulders while their clothes dried. For the first time, they stayed for more than a few minutes. Daniel, always the protector, sat closest to his siblings, his thin arm around Emma who'd developed a nasty cough. Lucas, the quietest of the 3, stared at Margaret with an intensity that made her uncomfortable until she realized he was memorizing her face, committing every detail to memory as if he knew somehow that this moment mattered. They talked that evening in ways they never had before. The triplets told her about their mother, how she used to sing to them before bed, how she made the best pancakes in the world, how she died suddenly from an undiagnosed heart condition that no one saw coming. They told her about their father's descent into depression and alcohol, how he tried his best but ultimately couldn't carry the weight of grief and 3 grieving children. They told her about foster homes where they were treated like burdens, where siblings were threatened with separation if they didn't behave, where kindness was conditional and love was non-existent. Margaret listened with tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. When Emma asked why she cried, Margaret told her the truth, because you deserve so much better than what life has given you. And because I wish I could do more. Daniel, wise beyond his 9 years, looked at her and said something that would echo in her mind for over a decade, "You're doing more than anyone else ever has. We won't forget that. I promise we won't forget." Then they left, disappearing back into the snowy night because they still didn't trust anyone enough to reveal where they slept, and Margaret stood at her bakery window watching them go, wondering if this was enough, if anything she did would ever truly be enough to change their trajectory. The incident. The winter that year was particularly harsh, and Margaret noticed the triplets struggling more than usual. Emma's cough had worsened into something that sounded like bronchitis, and Lucas had developed a limp from an injury he refused to talk about. Margaret did what she could, providing extra food, warm clothes, even over-the-counter medicine she purchased with money she didn't have to spare. But there was a limit to what one person could do without legal authority or resources, and Margaret was hitting that limit hard. She considered calling Child Protective Services dozens of times, her hand hovering over the phone, but every time she thought about Daniel's words about a system that had already failed them, she pulled back. She knew the statistics. She knew that children who ran from foster care rarely found better situations when they were returned. She knew that siblings were often separated. She couldn't be responsible for that, even if her inaction meant watching them suffer in other ways. In early January, Margaret's bakery faced its own crisis. The main oven, older than her marriage had been, finally gave out completely. The repair estimate was $3,000, money she absolutely did not have. Her savings account had been depleted months ago, and her credit cards were maxed out from buying food and supplies for the triplets. Her father offered to co-sign another loan, but Margaret refused, unwilling to burden him further at his age. She had 2 options: close the bakery temporarily and figure out how to get the money, or sell the equipment and shut down permanently. Neither option included a plan for continuing to feed 3 homeless children who depended on her. The stress manifested physically. Margaret stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night, lost even more weight, and developed stress-induced headaches that made her vision blur. Mrs. Chen found her crying in the back room one afternoon and sat with her, holding her hand while Margaret confessed everything: the broken oven, the impossible finances, her fear that she'd have to abandon the triplets just like everyone else had. Mrs. Chen listened quietly, then said something unexpected: "You're not alone in this. Let the community help. Within a week, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Chen had quietly spread the word about Margaret's situation, and neighbors began showing up with donations. It wasn't thousands of dollars, most people in the neighborhood didn't have that kind of money, but it was 20s and 50s and sometimes just 5s, accompanied by notes of encouragement and gratitude. The local hardware store owner offered to repair the oven at cost. A retired baker who'd heard about Margaret's work offered to volunteer a few days a week so she could rest. Even some of the children from the local elementary school held a bake sale and brought Margaret the proceeds in a jar decorated with construction paper hearts. In 3 weeks, they'd raised enough to fix the oven and keep the bakery running for another few months. Margaret was overwhelmed, humbled, and more determined than ever to keep her promise to the triplets. But something was changing with the children too. They were getting older, more cautious, more aware of the dangers of their situation. Daniel had turned 12, and with adolescence came new risks on the streets. Margaret noticed him becoming more protective, more suspicious of kindness, more burdened by the responsibility of keeping his siblings safe. One evening in March, the triplets didn't show up for dinner. Margaret waited an extra hour, growing increasingly anxious, before closing the shop and walking the neighborhood looking for them. She found them 3 blocks away, huddled in an alley behind a closed restaurant, and her heart shattered at the sight. Emma was running a fever, her face flushed and her breathing labored. Lucas's limp had gotten worse. Daniel looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. Margaret didn't ask permission. She simply told them they were coming with her, at least for tonight, and she'd figure out the rest tomorrow. She brought them to her tiny studio apartment, a space so small that all 4 of them barely fit, but it was warm and dry and safe. She gave them her bed and slept on the floor. She made soup and listened to their labored breathing while she planned her next move. The next morning, Margaret did something she'd been avoiding for months. She called a social worker she'd met years ago, a kind woman named Jennifer who worked specifically with homeless youth. She explained the situation honestly, her voice shaking as she admitted she'd been hiding the triplets from the system. Jennifer's response surprised her. Instead of judgment, there was compassion. "You kept them alive, Margaret. You gave them stability when they had none. Now let me help you give them more." Together, they worked out a plan. Jennifer knew of a specialized foster home that kept siblings together, run by a couple who'd raised 6 adopted children of their own. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the streets, better than separation, better than winter nights in alleys. The triplets resisted at first, terrified of being pulled apart again, but Margaret promised them she'd verified the placement herself, that she'd visit every week, that this wasn't abandonment, it was a chance for something better. Daniel looked at her with eyes that had seen too much for someone his age and asked the question that broke her heart, "Will you forget about us once we're gone?" Margaret knelt down so she was eye level with all 3 children, and she made them a promise she had every intention of keeping: "I could never forget you. You 3 changed my life. I'll be there every week until you tell me to stop coming. And even then, I probably won't stop." 2 days later, Jennifer arrived with the foster parents, a couple named Richard and Susan who had kind faces and patient voices. The triplets went with them, looking back at Margaret with a mixture of fear and hope, and she stood on the sidewalk waving until they disappeared from view. For the first time in almost 2 years, Margaret's mornings were different. There were no 3 faces pressed against her window. There were no paper bags to prepare. The routine she'd built her life around was suddenly gone, and the absence felt crushing. But she kept her promise. Every Saturday, she drove 40 minutes to the foster home and spent the afternoon with the triplets. She brought baked goods and helped with homework and listened to stories about their new school. She watched them slowly start to heal, to smile more easily, to act like children instead of survivors. Emma's cough finally cleared with proper medical care. Lucas got treatment for his injured leg. Daniel, gradually, allowed himself to let down his guard and trust that maybe this time, stability might actually last. The foster parents, Richard and Susan, welcomed Margaret's involvement, grateful for the connection and continuity she provided. Over months, then years, she watched the triplets transform from frightened street children into thriving young people with dreams and possibilities. Suspense. What Margaret didn't know during those Saturday visits, during the years she spent watching the triplets grow up and move forward with their lives, was that Daniel had made himself a promise the day they left her apartment. He'd written it down in a notebook Richard had given him, his handwriting shaky but determined. "When I grow up, I'm going to pay her back for everything. I'm going to make sure she never worries about money again. I'm going to show her that we didn't forget." Emma and Lucas made similar promises, each in their own way, each fueled by gratitude so profound it shaped every decision they made going forward. The triplets weren't just surviving anymore. They were planning. They were dreaming. And they were determined to turn those dreams into something real. By the time they turned 16, the triplets had been with Richard and Susan for 4 years, a record for stability in their young lives. They'd all thrown themselves into school with an intensity that surprised their teachers. Daniel discovered a talent for mathematics and computer science. Emma fell in love with literature and writing. Lucas found his passion in business and entrepreneurship. They weren't just good students, they were exceptional, driven by a combination of natural intelligence and the kind of motivation that comes from knowing exactly what failure looks like. Margaret attended every parent-teacher conference that Richard and Susan would allow her to, beaming with pride at report cards filled with A's and teacher comments about remarkable work ethic. But she noticed something else too. The triplets had become secretive about certain things, whispering among themselves and going quiet when she entered rooms. At first, she worried they were pulling away, establishing independence as teenagers do, but Richard assured her it was nothing concerning, just typical adolescent behavior. What Margaret didn't know was that the triplets had started working. Not just after-school jobs at fast food restaurants or grocery stores, though they did those too, but additional ventures they kept quiet. Daniel had taught himself advanced coding and started taking freelance programming jobs online, working late into the night to build websites and apps for clients who had no idea he was 16. Emma had started a small editing service, helping college students polish their papers for a fee. Lucas had become obsessed with investing, reading every book he could find on the stock market and convincing his siblings to let him manage the money they were earning. By the time they graduated high school, the triplets had saved nearly $40,000 combined, an amount that seemed impossible given their circumstances, but was entirely real thanks to their relentless work and Lucas's surprisingly savvy investment choices. College presented new challenges and opportunities. All three had been accepted to state universities with partial scholarships, but the remaining costs were still substantial. They took out loans, continued working multiple jobs, and lived more frugally than any of their peers. Margaret offered to help financially, but they refused every time, insisting she'd already given them more than enough. What they didn't tell her was that they'd created a plan, a 5-year plan that involved finishing college, launching their careers, and building enough financial success to come back and thank her in a way that would actually matter. It wasn't just about money, though that was part of it. It was about showing her that her faith in them had been justified, that her sacrifices had produced something meaningful, that kindness wasn't wasted even when it felt like it was. Daniel graduated with a degree in computer science and was immediately recruited by a tech startup in the city. His starting salary was more than Margaret made in a year at her bakery, and within 2 years he'd been promoted to senior developer and then team lead. Emma finished her English degree and surprised everyone by pivoting to marketing, discovering she had a natural talent for brand storytelling and digital strategy. She landed a position at a growing marketing firm and quickly became one of their top performers. Lucas, true to his passion, went straight into business, starting a small consulting company that helped other small businesses optimize their operations and finances. His first clients were restaurants and retail shops, businesses he understood intimately from watching Margaret struggle to keep her bakery afloat all those years. The triplets stayed in touch with Margaret throughout college and their early careers, visiting less frequently as their lives got busier, but never cutting contact completely. Margaret noticed they seemed happy but distracted, always working on something they couldn't quite explain. She assumed it was just the normal stress of young adults building careers in a competitive world. She had her own struggles to focus on anyway. The bakery, despite the community's earlier support, was facing new challenges. The neighborhood was slowly gentrifying, rents were increasing, and several longtime customers had moved away. Margaret, now in her late 50s, felt the physical toll of decades of 4 a.m. wake-up calls and 16-hour days. She'd developed arthritis in her hands that made kneading dough painful, and her back ached constantly from years of bending over work surfaces. She'd started thinking about retirement, though she had no idea how she'd afford it. Her savings were minimal. Social Security wouldn't cover much. The bakery was worth something, but not enough to live on for very long. She'd started having quiet panic attacks late at night, lying awake doing mental math that never added up to security. But she told no one, especially not the triplets who were building their own lives and didn't need to be burdened with her problems. Meanwhile, 40 minutes away in different corners of the city, Daniel, Emma, and Lucas were meeting every Sunday for what they called planning sessions. They'd been pooling their money for 3 years, investing aggressively, and they'd turned their combined savings into something substantial. Lucas's business had taken off unexpectedly when one of his strategies helped a struggling restaurant chain turn profitable, leading to more high-profile clients and significantly higher fees. Emma had been headhunted by a national marketing firm at nearly triple her previous salary. Daniel had moved to a major tech company and received stock options that had appreciated considerably. By their late 20s, the triplets had accumulated wealth that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. But they lived modestly, saving and investing the majority of their income, all working toward the same goal. They decided that when they turned 30, they would make their move. They would find a way to pay Margaret back for everything she'd done, not with a simple thank you or a gift basket, but with something that would actually change her life the way she'd changed theirs. They hired a private investigator to quietly research Margaret's current situation, her finances, her struggles, her needs. What they discovered broke their hearts. The bakery was barely profitable. Margaret was exhausted and in pain. She had almost nothing saved for retirement. She was too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to give up, grinding herself down to nothing in the service of a dream that was slowly killing her. The triplets made their decision. They would buy the building that housed her bakery and several adjacent properties that had recently come up for sale. They would renovate the space and create something new, a community center focused on feeding homeless youth and providing resources for struggling families. And they would put Margaret in charge of it, with a real salary, benefits, and the kind of security she'd never had. It would be called Sullivan's Place, named after the woman who'd saved their lives with nothing more than warm bread and unwavering kindness. The planning took 6 months. They worked with lawyers, architects, and contractors, all while keeping everything secret from Margaret. They pooled their resources, took out business loans, and committed to a project that would cost them nearly everything they'd saved. Their friends thought they were crazy to invest so much in a struggling neighborhood, but the triplets didn't care. This wasn't about profit. This was about debt, the kind that can never be repaid with money alone but can at least be acknowledged with a grand gesture of gratitude. Everything was in place by late November, exactly 15 years after Margaret had first seen 3 hungry children pressed against her bakery window. The triplets had arranged to have the property purchase finalize on a Friday, and they'd planned their visit for that evening, when Margaret would be closing up the shop. They'd rented luxury cars for the occasion, not to show off but because they wanted their arrival to feel significant, memorable, like the moment deserved gravitas and ceremony. They wanted Margaret to see how far they'd come, how completely her kindness had transformed not just their circumstances but their entire trajectory through life. As they drove toward Maple Street that rainy November evening, each of them felt the weight of the moment. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, rehearsing the words he'd say. Emma wiped tears from her eyes before they even arrived. Lucas sat in quiet contemplation, thinking about the little boy who used to limp through alleys and could now afford to change someone's life. And Margaret, completely unaware of what was about to happen, was locking up her shop and thinking about whether she could afford to keep it running through another difficult winter. She was thinking about pain medication for her arthritis and whether her old car would survive another season. She was thinking about everything except the 3 luxury vehicles that were about to pull up outside her door, carrying passengers whose faces she'd know instantly despite the years that had passed. She was thinking about everything except the fact that her life was about to change in ways she'd never dared to imagine. Revelation. When the first car door opened and Daniel stepped out into the rain, Margaret's heart stopped. She'd seen recent pictures during their occasional video calls, but seeing him in person after months of distance was different. He'd grown into a man, tall and confident, wearing a suit that spoke of success but carrying himself with the same careful grace he'd had as a 12-year-old protecting his siblings. Recognition flooded through her, followed immediately by confusion. Why was he here? Why the expensive car? Why now, on a random Friday evening? Before she could form words, Emma emerged from the second vehicle, and Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Emma had always been beautiful even as a sick child shivering in Margaret's back room, but now she was stunning, poised and professional, her eyes already brimming with tears as she moved toward Margaret. Lucas came last, stepping from the third car with a briefcase in hand and an expression of such profound emotion that Margaret felt her knees weaken. All 3 of them walked toward her through the rain, and Margaret realized she was crying before they'd even reached her. Daniel spoke first, his voice thick with feeling. "Hi, Margaret. It's been too long." She couldn't respond, could only shake her head and reach for them, pulling all 3 into an embrace that felt like coming home. They stood there in the rain for a long moment, holding each other while 15 years of gratitude and love and remembered kindness flowed between them. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret wiped her eyes and tried to laugh through her tears. "What are you doing here? Why didn't you tell me you were coming? And what's with the fancy cars?" Lucas smiled and gestured toward her bakery. "Can we go inside? There's something we need to talk to you about." Inside the shop, surrounded by the familiar smell of bread and the worn comfort of her life's work, Margaret made tea while the triplets arranged themselves around one of the small tables where customers occasionally sat to eat pastries. She noticed how they looked at each other, communicating silently the way they'd always done, and her confusion deepened. Finally, Daniel pulled out a folder from the briefcase Lucas had been carrying. "Margaret, before we explain anything, we need you to understand something. Everything we've become, everything we've accomplished, every success we've had, it started with you. You saved our lives. Not figuratively. Literally. We would have died on those streets or ended up in situations that would have destroyed us. You gave us food and warmth and safety, but more than that, you gave us proof that we mattered, that we were worth caring about. You gave us hope when we had none." Emma took over, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We made promises to each other when we were kids. We promised that if we ever got the chance to build real lives, we would come back and thank you properly. We would show you that your kindness wasn't wasted, that it grew into something beautiful. We've been working toward this for 15 years, Margaret. Everything we've done has been leading to this moment." Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her tea. "I don't understand. You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone should have done. You were children who needed help." Lucas shook his head gently. "That's where you're wrong. Most people didn't help. Most people looked away. You didn't just help, you committed. You sacrificed for us when you had almost nothing to sacrifice. You chose us over your own comfort and security. That's not what anyone would do. That's what someone extraordinary does." Daniel opened the folder and pulled out documents that Margaret couldn't quite focus on through her tears. "We know the bakery is struggling. We know you're exhausted and in pain and worried about the future. We know because we hired someone to find out, not to invade your privacy but because we needed to understand how to help you the way you helped us." He slid the first document across the table. "We bought this building, Margaret. And the 2 buildings next to it. They're yours now, held in a trust with you as the primary beneficiary. You own them free and clear. Margaret stared at the document, her brain struggling to process the words she was seeing. I can't, this is too much. You can't just give me buildings. Emma leaned forward, taking Margaret's hands in hers. We're not just giving you buildings. We're asking you to help us build something. We want to create a community center here, a place that feeds homeless youth and provides resources for struggling families. We want to call it Sullivan's Place, after you. And we want you to run it, with a real salary and benefits and everything you've never had. You'd still be doing what you love, feeding people, helping people, but you wouldn't have to sacrifice yourself to do it anymore. You could actually live, Margaret. You could retire comfortably someday. You could rest. Lucas added, we've already secured funding for the first 5 years of operation. We've hired architects to design the space. We've lined up partnerships with social services and local schools. All we need is you to say yes. This is your expertise, Margaret. You've been running a community center disguised as a bakery for decades. Now we want to make it official. Margaret's mind was reeling. She looked from one face to another, seeing the earnestness and hope and love in their eyes. These children she'd fed, these teenagers she'd visited every Saturday, these young adults who'd called her occasionally to share their successes, they'd become these incredible humans who were offering to transform her life. I saved you, she whispered. But you've saved me right back, haven't you? Daniel smiled. We learned from the best. You taught us that kindness is the most valuable thing we can give each other. You're just getting your own lesson back. The documents included everything: building deeds, architectural plans, financial projections, employment contracts. They'd thought of every detail, every practical concern, every possible objection she might raise. They'd built a complete vision of a future where Margaret's work could continue but her suffering could end. Margaret read through the papers with shaking hands, occasionally looking up at the triplets who watched her with barely contained excitement. When she reached the section outlining her salary, she gasped. It was more than 3 times what she'd ever made from the bakery, with full health insurance, dental, vision, and a retirement plan. This is too much, she said again, but her protest was weak because she knew they wouldn't accept it. It's exactly right, Emma corrected gently. It's what your work is actually worth. It's what you should have been earning all along if the world valued the right things. The evening stretched on as they explained every aspect of their plan. The renovation would take 4 months. During that time, Margaret would be on full salary as a consultant. The bakery could continue operating during the construction or she could close it, whatever she preferred, the choice was entirely hers. When Sullivan's Place opened, it would serve 3 meals a day to anyone who needed them, no questions asked, exactly the way Margaret had always operated. There would be a commercial kitchen, meeting rooms for support services, a small library, and even sleeping pods for emergency situations. It would be everything Margaret had dreamed of during those long nights when she'd wished she could do more for the triplets and others like them. Why? Margaret finally asked, the single word carrying the weight of her disbelief. Why go to all this trouble? Why spend all this money? Why me? The triplets looked at each other, and it was Lucas who answered. Because you saw us when we were invisible. You fed us when we were starving. You treated us like we were your own children when we were nobody's children. You gave everything you had even when you had nothing. How could we not do the same for you? How could we build successful lives and not bring you along? Your family, Margaret. You've always been family. The weight of their words, the magnitude of their gesture, the pure love radiating from 3 people who'd started as desperate strangers pressed against her window, it all crashed over Margaret at once and she wept. Not the quiet, dignified tears she'd shed earlier, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs of relief and gratitude and overwhelming emotion. She cried for the years of struggle, for the nights she'd gone to bed worried she'd lose everything, for the pain in her hands and the exhaustion in her bones, for the fear that her kindness had been just a drop in an ocean of need. She cried because that drop had somehow grown into a wave that was now lifting her up instead of drowning her. Resolution. When Margaret finally composed herself enough to speak, she asked the question that had been forming in the back of her mind since they'd started explaining their plan. What about you three? What about your lives, your own dreams? This must have cost you everything you've saved. I can't let you sacrifice your futures for me. Daniel shook his head with a slight smile. Margaret, we're not sacrificing anything. We're investing in something that matters more than bigger houses or fancier cars. Besides, we're doing better than you think. This project won't bankrupt us. We've been very careful about building our careers and managing our money. Lucas made sure of that. Lucas nodded. I learned from watching you, actually. You always found a way to make things work, to stretch resources, to prioritize what mattered. I applied those lessons to business and investing. We're comfortable, Margaret. More than comfortable. And this project, Sullivan's Place, it's not charity. It's a sound investment in community development. The neighborhood needs this, and it will create value in ways that go beyond money. Emma added, we also need you to know this isn't the end of our involvement. We're not just handing you a building and walking away. We want to be part of this. Daniel's company has committed to providing technology and infrastructure support. My firm is handling all the marketing and community outreach pro bono. Lucas will manage the finances and help with fundraising. This is a family project, Margaret. We're building this together. Margaret felt fresh tears threatening, but she smiled through them. A family project. I like the sound of that. She paused, looking around her small bakery, the worn counters and outdated equipment that had been her whole world for so long. This place has been my life. I poured everything into it. It's strange to think about letting it go, even for something better. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You're not letting it go. You're letting it grow into what it was always meant to be. That first morning when you put those cinnamon rolls in a bag for 3 scared kids, you started building Sullivan's Place. You just didn't know it yet. Over the next hour, they discussed practicalities and timelines, dreams and possibilities. The triplets had thought of everything, from hiring staff who understood food insecurity to partnering with local farms for fresh ingredients to creating a volunteer program for community members who wanted to help. They'd even included a small apartment in the renovation plans, a comfortable space above the main facility where Margaret could live if she wanted, eliminating her rent expense entirely and putting her even closer to the work she loved. As midnight approached and the rain finally stopped, Margaret walked the triplets to their cars. The street was quiet now, puddles reflecting the streetlights, and she looked at the building that had been her burden and blessing for so many years, trying to imagine it transformed into the vision they described. When do we start? She asked, and the joy on their faces told her it was exactly what they'd been hoping to hear. The construction began 3 weeks later. Margaret kept the bakery operating on a limited schedule, mostly because her regular customers needed the routine and she needed the comfort of familiar work while everything changed around her. But she also spent hours each day with architects and contractors, with Daniel and Emma and Lucas, planning every detail of Sullivan's Place. They created a commercial kitchen that would be 3 times the size of her current one but designed for efficiency and accessibility so her arthritis wouldn't prevent her from working when she wanted to. They built a dining area that felt warm and welcoming rather than institutional, with round tables and soft lighting and artwork from local students. They designed private spaces where families could meet with social workers and counselors, where homeless youth could shower and do laundry, where people could access computers and job resources. The transformation took exactly 4 months, and on a sunny March morning 15 years and 4 months after Margaret had first seen 3 hungry children outside her window, Sullivan's Place opened its doors. The neighborhood turned out in force. Mrs. Chen was there, as were dozens of other longtime customers and community members who'd supported Margaret through the years. Richard and Susan came with their family, beaming with pride at the triplets they'd helped raise. Local news covered the opening, drawn by the heartwarming story of homeless children who'd grown up to honor the woman who'd saved them. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moment came when the first guests began arriving for the inaugural meal. They were families struggling to make ends meet, elderly folks on fixed incomes, homeless individuals who'd heard about the new facility, and yes, several children with the same hollow-eyed hunger she remembered from Daniel, Emma, and Lucas all those years ago. Margaret stood behind the serving counter, ladling soup and passing out fresh bread, and felt a peace she'd never experienced before. She wasn't struggling to afford ingredients. She wasn't worried about keeping the lights on. She wasn't sacrificing her health to barely stay afloat. She was doing exactly what she'd always done, feeding people who needed feeding, but now she had help and resources and the security to sustain it long term. Daniel worked beside her that first day, his expensive suit replaced with an apron, serving food alongside the woman who taught him that survival and dignity could coexist even in desperate circumstances. Emma managed the front area, greeting guests with warmth and ensuring everyone felt welcome rather than judged. Lucas handled logistics in the back, making sure supplies were stocked and operations ran smoothly. As Margaret watched a young mother accept a meal with tears of gratitude, she understood something profound. The triplets hadn't just paid her back. They'd created a system that would pay forward her kindness to hundreds, maybe thousands of people over the years to come. They'd taken her small, unsustainable acts of compassion and built an infrastructure around them that would outlast all of them. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the principle she'd lived by becoming a permanent fixture in a neighborhood that desperately needed it. That evening, after the last guest had been served and the kitchen cleaned, Margaret sat with the triplets in her new apartment upstairs. It was modest but comfortable, with a view of Maple Street and the building that now bore her name. "I still can't believe this is real," she admitted. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and discover it was a beautiful dream." Emma took her hand. "It's real, Margaret. And it's going to keep being real for as long as you want to be part of it. You gave us a future when we had none. We wanted to give you one too. A future where you can rest, where you can enjoy the work without being destroyed by it, where you can see the impact of your kindness multiplied beyond what any one person could do alone." The months that followed brought adjustments and learning curves, but they also brought profound satisfaction. Sullivan's Place quickly became a cornerstone of the community. They served over 300 meals a day within the first month. They connected 17 homeless youth with stable housing and educational resources. They helped 12 families access food assistance programs and job training. The numbers grew steadily, but so did the volunteer base and community support. Margaret worked 4 days a week now instead of 7, taking Wednesdays off completely and leaving Sundays to younger staff. She finally had time to see doctors about her arthritis, to attend a book club Mrs. Chen invited her to simply rest when her body needed it. The triplets visited regularly, Daniel every week, Emma and Lucas at least twice a month. They brought their partners when they started dating seriously, introducing them to Margaret as if seeking her blessing, which in a way they were. She'd become the grandmother figure none of them had growing up, the matriarch of a family built not on blood but on the choice to care for each other across years and circumstances. 2 years after Sullivan's Place opened, Lucas got married and asked Margaret to stand with his family during the ceremony. She wore a dress Emma helped her pick out and cried happy tears as she watched the scared little boy she'd once fed in alleys promise his life to someone who loved him. 3 years in, Emma published her first book, a memoir about growing up homeless and the power of small kindnesses, dedicated to Margaret with words that made her weep, for Margaret Sullivan, who taught us that love is action, and that one person with a generous heart can change the entire trajectory of someone's life. You saved us. Now we hope our story saves someone else. The book became a regional bestseller and brought even more attention to Sullivan's Place, resulting in grants and donations that expanded their services to include after-school programs for at-risk youth and a weekend farmers market where fresh produce was offered on a pay-what-you-can basis. Daniel's tech company created a donation platform specifically for community food programs, using Sullivan's Place as the pilot project. The success led to the model being replicated in 6 other cities, each one crediting Margaret's original vision. For years after that rainy November evening when 3 luxury cars pulled up to her struggling bakery, Margaret celebrated her 65th birthday at Sullivan's Place. The Triplets organized a surprise party that filled the dining hall with hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work, some from decades ago, some from just weeks before. There were speeches and tears and laughter, and when they presented her with a framed photo collage showing her journey from that first day feeding 3 children to now, surrounded by community and purpose, Margaret felt the full weight of a life well lived. She thought about all the moments when she could have given up, when the struggle felt too heavy, when she wondered if anything she did mattered. She thought about the choice she'd made to open her door to 3 hungry children instead of calling the authorities or looking away like so many others had. Standing there surrounded by proof that kindness compounds, that small acts ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control, Margaret finally understood what the Triplets had been trying to tell her all along. She hadn't just saved them. They hadn't just saved her. Together, they'd created something that was saving people every single day, and would continue saving people long after all of them were gone. That was the real miracle, not the money or the buildings or even the transformed lives, though those were all wonderful. The real miracle was the multiplication of compassion, the way one woman's decision to feed 3 children had grown into a movement that fed thousands, that inspired volunteers, that changed how an entire neighborhood thought about caring for its most vulnerable members. Engagement CTA. As Margaret stood at the window of her apartment that night, looking down at the street where she'd first encountered 3 desperate children, she thought about all the people who'd walked past them before she stopped. She thought about how easy it would have been to mind her own business, to protect her limited resources, to decide that 3 more hungry kids weren't her responsibility. She thought about the voice in her head that had told her she couldn't afford to help, that she barely had enough for herself, that someone else with more resources should step in. And she thought about how grateful she was that she'd ignored that voice, that she'd followed her heart instead of her fear, that she'd chosen connection over self-preservation. Because that choice, that simple decision to fill 3 paper bags with warm food on a cold November morning, had given her everything that mattered: family, purpose, legacy, and proof that the world could be better than it often was. The lights of Sullivan's Place glowed warmly in the darkness, and Margaret could see the night staff preparing for the evening meal service. Soon people would arrive, some she'd recognize and some she wouldn't, all of them carrying their own stories of struggle and survival. They'd be fed without judgment, treated with dignity, reminded that they mattered. And maybe, just maybe, one of them would be inspired to pass that kindness forward someday, to be for someone else what Margaret had been for Daniel, Emma, and Lucas. That was the legacy she was most proud of, not the building with her name on it, but the ripple effect of compassion spreading outward in directions she'd never see, touching lives she'd never meet, proving that love in action was the most powerful force in the world. Now, we want to hear from you. How would you have felt if you were Margaret, struggling to keep your business alive while feeding 3 children you barely knew? Could you have made the same choice she did, sacrificing your own security for strangers? And if you'd been one of those triplets, how would you have repaid someone who'd saved your life the way Margaret saved theirs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and we love hearing your perspectives on these stories. Where are you watching from right now? Let us know your city or country. It helps us understand our amazing community around the world. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the power of small acts of kindness, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. This is what we believe, that every single person has the capacity to change someone's life. You don't need wealth or power or special skills. You just need to see people who are suffering and decide that their pain matters to you. Margaret was just a bakery owner barely making ends meet, but she had a generous heart and she acted on it. The Triplets were just scared children surviving on the streets, but they remembered kindness and they honored it when they had the chance. All of us are somewhere on that spectrum. Sometimes we're the ones with something to give, sometimes we're the ones who desperately need help. The question is whether we'll be brave enough to give when we can and humble enough to receive when we must. Whether we'll believe that our small contributions matter even when we can't see the full picture of what they might become. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what we have coming next week. We're bringing you the unbelievable true story of a janitor who worked at the same school for 40 years, never making more than minimum wage, living in a tiny apartment and driving a car held together with duct tape. Everyone thought they knew his story, thought they understood his simple life. But when he passed away, what they discovered in his will shocked the entire town and revealed a secret that changed how everyone thought about wealth, sacrifice, and what really matters in life. You won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you catch that video the moment it drops. Thank you so much for being here, for caring about these stories, for believing that goodness still exists in the world. We'll see you in the next one.